This is the Therapy Chat podcast with Laura Reagan, lcsw-c. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, lcsw-c.
Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, and today I'm so happy to be speaking with two wonderful teachers and leaders in the field, Dick Schwartz and Thomas Hübl. Dick and Thomas, thank you so much for being my guests on Therapy Chat today.
Great to be with you again, Laura.
Thank you for having us.
You're so welcome. So you two have written a book together, and I'm really interested in hearing about that. But even more than the book, just this idea of expanding the way we think about healing, trauma, and trauma therapy and healing in general. But before we get into it, can we start off by each of you taking a moment to just tell everyone who's listening a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, my name is Thomas Hübl, and I'm passionate about how we develop kind of a wider lens on individual healing. Like individual and collective healing are interdependent, they belong together. I think many wisdom traditions for thousands of years spoke about the collective dimension of healing as well as the individual. And I think that's something great to rediscover, especially in modern Western civilization. And I'm also deeply immersed in a deep contemplative path. And I think the spiritual dimension of the healing work is very, very important too.
Yeah, so I'm Dick Schwartz, and the last 42 years, I've been developing and trying to bring this internal family systems model, which started out as a form of psychotherapy and has expanded to become kind of life practice, spiritual practice, and as I did that, my lens, which originally was family therapy, so originally I was interested more in systems healing, then focused in on healing people internally with these parts and self. And then, as I ran into what we call legacy burdens and things like that, got more and more interested in what Thomas does and how can we have groups of people work on this stuff and together, what I call unburden it. And so I think I reached out first to Thomas because I respected what he was doing with large groups. And yeah, we become friends and collaborators, and the book is a product of that.
So would you like to tell us just a little bit about the book first before we get into really why this is needed?
Well, first of all, as Dick said, I think from the moment we met, there was a resonance, and I felt, I'm meeting somebody that is very interested in combining how individual inner work, which is very important, individual trauma work is connected, is not separate from our ancestral work, but it's a consequence of it. Mm-hmm. And that the ancestral work is not separate from the collective trauma work. We have large wounds, being it racism or being colonialism or a Holocaust or genocides or whatever is war wounds. It's all over the world. So the world is a scarred place. And so we have been born into scar tissue. And so if it just isolate attachment trauma from the rest, that doesn't really make sense. It's important to be able to focus, but I think it's not enough to just keep that focus without taking the entire system of trauma into account. And so when I met Dick, I felt, wow, we can have a dialogue, and we were passionate about similar things. And I think opening the map of healing without losing specificity, to be able to be specific, but to have a wider context, I think is very, very important, and we resonated deeply. In this interest, we share this interest, and so, yeah, I think the book is a natural outcome of multiple conversations, a course that we taught together, a language that we refined together, and this mutual interest in each other's work and finding the resonance patterns.
Totally agree. That was well said. I don't need to add anything.
Beautiful. Yeah. So, there's a couple things that maybe we should just sort of define before we move into our conversation, because I know for myself, I have religious trauma. And so I used to really react to the word spiritual and spirituality. When people would say spiritual, I would be like, that's just religion in another form. But now over time, I've learned that, spirituality is not the same as religion at all. But for a lot of people, that word is a turnoff, and a lot of trauma survivors get very activated by hearing that. So can you kind of talk about what you mean when you say spirituality?
Well, I can start on that because I was similar to you in the sense I was allergic to anything really spiritual, not because I was hurt by a religious system, but more because I come from a very scientific family, and my father repeatedly would say he would blame religion for all the world's problems, all the wars and so on. And so I came kicking and screaming to the idea that there are these other spiritual realms, and had these huge skeptical parts. But what I got from my father was a good scientist follows the data regardless of where it takes them, even if it's way outside your paradigm. And the data from working with clients, when I would get them into these inner worlds with their parts, spiritual things would start happening. You couldn't deny it. I mean, I tried for quite a while. This thing that we now call a guide would come in, and I would say, okay, that's just a really nice, helpful part. But then when you interview it, it says, no, I'm not a part. I'm here to help, and I came from this other world. And the first few times I thought, okay, well, that part's trying to pretend it's not the part. But after you do that 50 times, you start to say, maybe there's something else. Maybe. So it really started to open my mind. And also what I'm calling self, I couldn't understand from a psychological point of view, because when I would get people by simply getting their parts to open space, and the self would show up and with these C-word qualities in people who had been horribly, horribly parented and abused and tortured, there was no way I could understand from an attachment theory point of view or traditional psychological point of view how people had that kind of parenting could have those kind of qualities. And it wasn't until I had some students that said, maybe what you're finding here and calling self is really what Hindus call Atman, or what Buddhists call Buddha nature, or what Christians call Christ consciousness, and as I looked around, it turned out that virtually every spiritual tradition had a word for it, and almost no other psychology did. And so that opened my mind too, more and more, to these possibilities. And now I'm a total convert. I mean, I just totally believe in these other worlds, and that there are ways to access them that we've moved away from, that indigenous populations have had for centuries, and that the fact that this is very related to what Thomas was saying, the fact that we've cut off from that because our rational Western materialistic mind doesn't allow for it, has got us way off path. And these spiritual guides really want us to get back on path and not destroy the planet and not destroy each other. So each of us have our ways of accessing that, but that's some of what we're trying to bring collectively also.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Like I had a bit of a different access point. Let's say, like I felt already as a child that I was like, I had as a child a deep connection to the divine, but I grew up in a Catholic environment around Vienna, and I couldn't kind of relate to the environment. It was cold. It felt disrelated. I don't know. It didn't speak to me. And so that kind of church environment, and it's not about the church itself. It's about my experience that I had in this village that I grew up in. And then when I was 19, I felt this very strong call to meditate every day. So I didn't know anything about meditation. I became quiet. I found this place inside my heart where I can really be still. And also I felt guided, like I knew things. And then when I was 26, I left my medical studies and I became like, I felt very strongly I need to go out somehow. I didn't know for how long. And I meditated for 4 years, basically. I had this like retreat. And this was very profound for me. And throughout this time, and of course my meditation continued later, and it deepened through my groups, and ever since it's a process that's deepening. But I also studied a lot about mystical traditions, and then I understood more and more that what mystics like saints and sages have been telling about where they were speaking from is that mystical reality is the essence of any spiritual tradition. The religious body is the social environment that we create. And often the social environment that we create is very much filtered through the understanding of everybody that is part of it. But that's not the place that saints and sages speak from. That's very important. And I think because of that, it can create a lot of harm. It can become very extreme. And that creates a lot of harm. So I think there is a lot of trauma being created through this kind of very extremist views. But when you look at the mystical traditions, from a mystical point of view, you wouldn't separate science and spirituality. You wouldn't separate psychotherapy from a spiritual path. It doesn't make sense. That separation doesn't make sense seen from a mystical lens. It makes sense seen from the lens of separation. And so I think Dick and I, we came from different pathways to a similar place. And I think that's also the beauty. Like it's the beauty that how we get to it is very, very interesting and beautiful. And so, and of course, healing was always like a main expression for, on that path for me too. But I think the mystical understanding and the wisdom traditions, there's so much knowledge that can be so beautifully combined with conventional therapy and healing methodologies. It's a very powerful combination. So I often speak about this inner and outer science in dialogue. Inner science being the mystical science, outer science being our academic sciences. And so I think it's very powerful.
Yeah. And when you speak of wisdom traditions, I think that, that's a way of looking at mystical things and, everything from what happens in meditation to, even the alchemy between two people that happens in a therapy session or in a group setting. As a therapist, when you're doing groups, some kind of magic happens within the group that you didn't do it. It's something that is created, from the way the space is held and the dynamic between the group participants. And, that happens in all of our gathering spaces.
I can speak to that. And I think, again, we have different words for it, but we both have seen that phenomenon a lot, where when you bring people together collectively and you help them access a certain place, what forms is like when I do individual work, there's a self that has these great C-word qualities that we can access by getting parts open space. When I can be as a leader in that place, and then it's kind of contagious. And also, as everybody does the practices and so on, and there becomes a kind of group self that sort of facilitates and expedites the healing of everybody. And so we can do pieces of work in that context that might take 5 individual sessions to happen. So we're both trying to take advantage of that as well.
Yeah, I can just underline what you just said, Dick. It's like many of our therapists in the group say the same thing. Like what happens here in 20 minutes, it takes 4 or 5 sessions in the practice. When the group is really very coherent and there are hundreds or whatever, many people in a room, I think there's such an amazing power. And we have had like large groups. We had Holocaust survivors or their descendants and Nazi descendants in the room, and in the moment that self or that power coheres, it's unbelievable how sacred it feels. And then the deepest pain that might be in the room, or the deepest tension, or the deepest atrocities that have been inflicted, like amazing healing can happen. And so I really think that we do not utilize this power enough in modern societies. I think there is a lack. And that's also the reason, as Dick said, why we came together, is also to speak more to the power and how to combine these different methodologies in collective healing spaces.
Yeah. So, Dick, do you want to say anything to that?
Just I completely agree. And Thomas has a lot more experience doing that than I do. And I've now worked with groups of a couple hundred, whereas he's been working with groups of 1,000 or more. And some of the vision, and, whether we do this together or separately, for me, is to have similar kinds of groups happening all over the world with people who know how to lead them, and work on developing a protocol for leaders to do this. Because what I haven't talked about yet is, and what Thomas mentioned, is if you bring people together who have all these what we call legacy burdens that came down from ancestors or came down from their ethnic group, or just are floating around in the culture, like racism and patriarchy and so on. And you have people find that in them, because many people, like good liberals like us, try to pretend we don't have any of that. And
good liberals like us.
Right. And it feels, in a collective context where everybody's doing it and admitting it, a lot easier to acknowledge that it's there. And then when you can go to it, it's possible to unload it a lot of the time pretty quickly sometimes. So to me, that's part of the larger vision.
Thank you both for what you've shared. And I'm just thinking about several things. One thing is, I don't know why exactly it's so poignant for me. Like why for me it's so poignant, but it's major, important work. But to think of having descendants of Nazis and descendants of Holocaust survivors together working toward healing. And, we talked about this when you were on my podcast before, Thomas, about, like people from the former Yugoslavia and, all these places where genocides have happened and civil wars have happened. And for one, what hasn't happened in the U.S., we haven't had a reckoning with the impact of our Civil War, which was more recent. And then before that, the colonization and the harm that the colonizers did to the people who were here who lived on this land, the indigenous peoples. It's so palpable how you continue to see this, energy of this aggrieved group, the dominant group claiming to be victimized. And then, the people who have been impacted the most marginalized groups always being scapegoated as this is the problem, and I feel hopeful that what you're both talking about could be possible here too. And yet we're so far from that in our culture, from even, there's, as we all know, there are people who don't want anyone to even talk about the fact that there is racism or that there was harm done to the native peoples of this country. And, but it's just like in a family where there's been abuse, that the family doesn't want to talk about the abuse. And they say, let's just pretend it didn't happen and sweep it under the rug. And then, the rug has a huge lump that everyone can see and nobody's talking about. And, everybody's reacting to it, even though we can't feel it. So it's like hopeful and discouraging all at the same time to think about it.
Yeah, it's a little hard in our country to be hopeful at the moment because I'm very into the parallels. And you started to mention the parallels between a family and the culture, and it also is parallel with this internal system. So a lot of trauma survivors have parts that want to deny it happened or minimize it and just move on and, focus on all the good all the time. And that leaves these exiled parts of people suffering alone and feeling rejected. And you see the same thing happening in families, but you also see the same thing. I mean, Trump was just hearing the news today, is really actively trying to get the Smithsonian to change history and, just to focus on the great things about the U.S. And you're right. That just leaves the exiles in our culture suffering even more and feeling more rejected and denied. And, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa tried to do some of this. I don't know that they really did a great job with it, but it's such a different approach. And I even think, Thomas, in Germany, there was an effort to really focus on what these Nazi generations did so that it wouldn't happen again. But no, the U.S. is really not wanting to do that at all, at least the current administration. And so we kind of have to do it ourselves. We have to do it underground.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what needs to be done. I think there is such a need. I often say, like in these conversations also, like, there was this time when we delivered babies and we didn't wash our hands or disinfect our hands. And it created a very high mortality rate until we discovered, wait a moment, there are bugs on our hands. And if we don't clean them before, so it contributes to a high mortality rate. So once you know that, and you deliver babies with dirty hands, so that's not at all responsible. And I think given the last 40, 50 years, we know too much about trauma that we could say, well, we just leave it as it is because, time will heal our wounds. And I say, what are you saying? Time is a result of our wounds, maybe the way we understand time. And we are stuck in the past. And then we are recreating similar cycles. So that's definitely not going to heal our wounds. That will repeat a lot. And that's why I think it's not responsible. We know too much about trauma, ancestral and collective trauma, to leave it that way. And I think if it's not being done from a level of government, so it needs to be done as a civil society movement. And we will, and the more evidence and the more we show it's working. And I see in many of our groups how it's working, like how collectives can become healing environments, and that we transcend the separation of individuals being separate particles, and instead of being integral aspects of their environments and their ecosystems. And so I think we just need to do it. That's why we also put our forces together and write this book together, because and more people are coming that are working in this ecosystem and saying, listen, the collective healing is important. And we will just do it. And everybody who is invited or who feels similar is maybe also doing it. And so together, and when you look at our collective trauma summit, we had, I don't know, somewhere every year between 60 and 100,000 participants. So there is interest and there is a need. And so it just needs to be done until it shows its effects. And yeah.
And the other thing I really believe is that even with an individual, if you do a piece of unburdening, it has ripples that are way beyond the individual. And so when you do it with a large group, it has bigger ripples, well beyond just the individuals in that group, in terms of this sort of spiritual level of healing that the planet has burdens. There's all this darkness in places, and as we bring more self energy and we unburden ourselves, we have more access to self energy, and then we can access not only spiritual wisdom but also the big self, and the unburdenings start to help the kind of planetary unburdening as well. So it's a message to therapists that when you're doing this work, you're doing something bigger also.
And maybe one more thing to add from my side to this is also that, like when you, with an individual client, you would look at the intelligence of the defense, what I would call defense or whatever, like protector part is guarding like that exile. And so in the collective, what we are seeing is a strong, protected exile.
Always.
And so it is also part of our skill how to relate to that, because otherwise we externalize it as a problem, which usually happens also in individual clients, that what's hard inside, it becomes a problem outside. And so I think that a similar skill, speaking of parallels, I think we need to also learn how to work with those collective defense mechanisms and bring those on board and see their intelligence. And I think that would also add to a shift in the collective sphere or in society or culture.
Totally agree.
Yeah. So I'm curious about how, well, a couple things. So in parts work or IFS, if you are getting in touch with an ancestor, or if there's a burden that you're carrying and you find that it's a legacy burden, how does that work? Like, how do you unburden the ancestor, and what does that do?
Yeah. So I started getting into this maybe 25 years ago, when ordinarily when we work with people, we have them focus on a part, and when we get to what I call exiles, these parts that are so hurt, to heal them, we ask them to show where they're stuck in the past, and people will get scenes from their history, from their families or from traumas in their lives. And we stay with that until the part feels witnessed, and then we go and we get it out of where it's stuck in the past, and we bring it into the present and help it unload the feelings and beliefs, which we call the burdens that it got from those times. And I was doing that, and people started to witness scenes that were clearly not from their lives, that clearly were from, in many cases, their ancestors, some of them sort of recent ancestors, and some go back, way, way back. and that it was still an important thing to do, was to witness what happened to those people that was passed down through the generations, and that this part was still carrying not only the pain from those experiences and the shame, but also the information about what happened, because it doesn't just go away. And I've found through trial and error that not only could we then unload the legacy burden, but we could also invite, because this started happening spontaneously too, that as we went to unload that legacy burden from the part, clients would say, I see my mother's spirit is here, or I see my grandfather is here too. And so ancestors would start showing up, and we would invite them to do the same. And as I studied other systems, there's something called soul retrieval and shamanism, and a lot of other systems do something similar. And it turned out that once a part decides it doesn't want to have to keep carrying this, they can unload it. And we have a sort of spiritual way to unload it and transform the burden. And when I would ask parts if they wanted to do that, some were ready, but many had fears about letting it go. Some were afraid that they're betraying their people if they don't carry the pain, that they need to keep the memories alive, and they need to stay hypervigilant, or it could happen again, sort of that never again philosophy. And so it took some convincing that wasn't true, and that there was a self who could protect them, rather than having to carry all this toxic stuff all the time. And so on. There are a number of different objections to letting this stuff go right away that we've now learned how to address. But once the part was ready, then we could have maybe the light come in and shine on the part and tell it to just give it up out of its body and let it go into the light, and the part would feel much better. So that's how we do it. And then a woman named Tamala Floyd in particular has pioneered in and then thereafter setting up connections with ancestors so that they also become helpers in your life. And I don't do that so much as she does, but it's really interesting to me as well.
Yes. Tamala, I have her book, Listening When Parts Speak, and it's like so great. And met her in Spain, went with you on the Camino trip. So, so then for Tamala's way of doing it, the ancestor is there with the person and they can have them as a resource in their system. And then how do we apply that like collectively?
Go ahead, Thomas.
No, it's like I use a bit of a different language for like, but in our work, we're saying, okay, our ancestors are our roots. And through our ancestors, we are rooted as the planet. Because it seems like that a lot of this collective and intergenerational wounds create the experience as if my body is looking at nature versus nature is looking at nature. That's very different. And so what we experience is that when people heal their intergenerational ancestral wounds or disconnect, our roots become more open, vivid, they become more resourced. So our ancestors are more part of our life and felt as a resource. But one of the effects is also that I feel more connected to everything. And I think one big part that many people suffer from is like a sense of isolation, a sense of separation. Trauma creates this crack in the window, like suddenly you have a crack and you have two. And the same is true in our roots. We feel separate. And then it creates an entire social system where that is not sustainable, because traumatic stress is not sustainable. It overconsumes our inner resources. It overconsumes physical resources just from our physical body. And that's why over longer time, it creates all kinds of health issues. And so the more what Dick beautifully described is like that, also grounding ourselves deeper in the roots. And as the planet, I see, wow, I am also planet. I'm not just like a separate particle looking at the planet, but I feel part of an interdependent system of a data stream. And that data stream is flowing through me as it flows through everybody else too. And I think that sense gives us more like a centeredness and connects us more to the collective field. And then, because I think there is like trauma creates one big like two big illusions. One is that hope is in the future instead of hope is in the agency. And the other one is that this idea, I could have done it better. Let's say we could live more sustainably. And I would challenge that notion. I would say, are you sure? If we don't live sustainably, if we over-extract resources from the planet, if we burn down our biosphere, if we like put too much CO2 out there, I don't know if we could, in this state of awareness, could do it differently. If we stop for a moment, we reflect on what we do, we change something in our inner way of acting, then we can do it differently. But it doesn't work just by putting more effort in trying to do it differently. That usually leads to the repetition compulsion that we all know. And therefore, I think the collective dimension is also the more we can ground ourselves and feel as part of, then we can really create a more sustainable society, and a society that is more in tune with and as the planet. And then I think a lot of how we share resources, how we live together, how we do not overconsume because we don't need it, because regulation is regulated. I need what I need, and I can be there for others as I need, and I will not burn myself just because I'm there for others. So there is a regulation in all directions. And I think so that is one, I mean, there are so many other aspects, but I think that is one aspect of doing the intergenerational work. And the other one is that we have a much responsibility, means that I'm able to respond to the actions of my ancestors. Mm-hmm. I don't need to deny it, and I'm not overly identified with it. I have a healthy relationship to whatever that was. And if there was trauma, it's trauma. And if there was transgression, it's transgression. But it's whatever it is, I have a responsive relationship to that. And I think often when it's not looked at, then we reenact some of these parts in our own life. And so that's maybe a bit of a different language, but I think it says pretty similar things as Dick said before.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like what you said about, I mean, something that I've been thinking about regarding this conversation is that it's not just the trauma of victimization that we carry, that we all are carrying in some form, whether it's from our own direct experience or our ancestors, but also the harm that we've done to others or that our ancestors have done to others is we're holding both. And I think we spend so much energy denying both, denying the ways that we've been victimized and denying the ways that we've harmed others. And like, for example, the way that Dick said earlier, like, you know, good liberals, like, I know that was sort of tongue in cheek because everyone wants to be good and no one wants to be bad. But the truth is that all of us, you know, are harmed and cause harm. It's part of being alive. It's not just about never being harmed or causing harm. It's about what you do from that place, from there. And I think that our unwillingness to see the ways we've been harmed or the harm that we've done leads to so much additional suffering and additional harm that happens. You know, like the ways that we don't want to face our own victimization and individual trauma therapy. That's one of the biggest barriers, is not recognizing that we have experienced trauma. So we spend all this time trying not to be a victim. And meanwhile, inside of our bodies, these chemicals are coursing through us in response to these unresolved wounds and impacting our health and our behavior long term.
Yeah, I
Anybody
totally agree.
thinking anything you want to say? Yeah.
I'm here in a hotel in Palm Beach, Florida, because I just presented at this eudaimonia conference, which was crawling with people who were so focused on optimizing their health and their longevity. And part of what I said was, you can do all the things here, you can do all the practices, but if you've got a little kid stuck in a horrible scene in your past who's constantly afraid and feels very betrayed and abandoned by you, you're not going to be healthy ultimately. And no matter how much of that other stuff you do with your diet and your breath work and meditation and all the bypasses. So, and I started calling it a wellness bypass, as like the spiritual bypass. And so, yeah, I very much agree. And again, our culture really reinforces that. This is a rugged individualist culture now, especially with Trump. And you're a loser if you're ever vulnerable, and you have to dominate and win and so on. And it's just permeated now. And so, yeah, I think I'm just agreeing with what you're saying. Let me add one more thing, and that is, it's equally or even sometimes harder to go to and admit to the parts that do want to hurt people. And again, especially for us people who want to pretend like we're great all the time. And, but that's been a focus of mine. I've consulted to a treatment center for sex offenders for a couple of years, and we just completed a pilot study with intimate partner abusers in the state of Washington. We're hoping to get money to do a big study with that. And just to have people, and it was in a group, and to have these quote unquote perpetrators come together and find their perpetrating parts and then see what happened to make these parts the way they are and have compassion for each other. And yeah, it was very powerful pilot study.
Yeah, it's not that we want to say that harming people is a good thing to do, but we can't just throw people away over. And, I think we all understand that everyone has, elements of good and bad inside of us. And we don't, if we reduce people to kind of like one-dimensional or two-dimensional cartoon character rather than, just a mix of all of the different elements of what makes us human. Then you think that some people are just not worthy of belonging within the society. And that's kind of what we're doing here. And that's what colonized societies do. But also, like, we can't forget, it's not for no reason either. There's a group of people who are benefiting from all of us being at each other's throats. And, so it's really a subversive idea to say that, like, we are all interconnected and that the way out of this planet destruction path that we're on is to come together and count on each other and to believe that there's a way forward in life that is not just the good guys beat the bad guys, but everyone comes together and, for all of our survival and well-being.
Yeah, you said something like very powerful. So in our work, I often said, because what you're pointing to, that we're all interconnected, is very complex and challenging, because it's easier to say, these were the Nazis. I often use this as an example. It's like a poster. It's a two-dimensional version. I don't need to feel anything when I say that. But if somebody tells me, well, that concentration camp guard was a loving father, that's already more difficult to swallow. Because when I start to feel something, then I cannot just make an X and say like, well, that's all bad, because even whatever is dark or painful or harmful is not just one dimension or two dimension. It's not a poster. It's a complexity of a human being. And I think that to see in our work, we call this a 2D image as a defense, like you 2D the world. You don't feel the world anymore through your body. It becomes a mental image in a kind of numb body. Mm-hmm. And so when I don't feel anything, I can make you an image that is at the distance that helps me to feel less and make you whatever into something. But that is the state of re-traumatization. Because when I'm really connected to you, I cannot hurt you. But when I'm not connected to you, I can say and do all kinds of things. Look at social media. We put stuff out that is horrifying on social media because we don't feel, obviously, like when you look at millions of users, the stuff that has been said, you would most probably never say if the person is in the room. You can just put it there. Because, and I think that defense, that we become more aware if we ourselves or other people are in that state. And because part of the ecosystemic healing is also social awareness. I think the more we feel when that happens. And the other thing is trauma also, I believe, does something that is very simple but very impactful. It hurts the brain's capacity to modulate internal and external sensory input. So the inner world is suddenly not connected anymore to the outer world, like as if the bridge is broken. So I cannot feel myself and you at the same time. And when that modulation is less and less working, or more and more compromised, then the outside can be X, whatever X is for me. And that's a state, I think, where in families, a lot of trauma is being reenacted in intimate relationships. And societally, that's how we other groups. But having a wider social awareness of that state, that how to come back to a three-dimensional state would mean I feel my body, and that's why I feel you in your three-dimensionality. I can feel you as a being. You have emotions, you have a body, you're not just my mental image. And I think that mechanism that you spoke to, that we are really interconnected, is very challenging because it takes the painkiller away. Mm-hmm. And obviously we need that painkiller to keep a lot of stuff frozen that is in the legacy burdens of our cultures, stay frozen for a reason.
Yeah. In the book, I describe an example of working with a Jewish woman who really hated Hamas, but just hated Palestinians in general because of what happened, and had her find the Holocaust legacy burden and unburden it. And it produced this huge shift in her perception. She said, I really see much more the humanity of those, what I thought were others, and I can't other people anymore. And it just is a nice example of how exactly what Thomas is saying, that these protective parts and the legacy burdens that they carry just totally close our hearts and destroyed our perception through our eyes. I mean, when people do this work, I start by look through the lens of that protector, and what does your opponent look like? And they'll say, looks like a monster. Okay, now you're not going to be with that person, so just ask this protector to step out. And suddenly they see past the protectors of the opponent, and they see the exiles that drive them, and they have compassion. And so that's what both of us are trying to bring.
Yeah. Well, I am so, so grateful for what you're doing, that you came here to talk about it, and that you've written this book, which will be, will be out when this airs. So, that's very exciting. And, I think this approach, it just makes everything a lot more complicated. And it's a lot more painful when you look at life this way, but it's real. It's what's really going on. So thank you for the courage to try to make such an important impact in our world, and using your platforms and your voices to really make positive change. I really appreciate both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
And great to be with you again.
Yes, lovely to be in your presence. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Same to you. So, where will we tell people that they can find the book? Do you know the link, or otherwise I'll just put it in the show notes?
I think releasingourBurdens.com is the website.
Well, yeah. So no later than December 2nd, it will be out there for everyone to buy. And, again, thank you so much for the important work you do and for being who you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, lcsw-c. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.